is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? This is Matt Murphy, the host of Dharma Knights. This week, I'm actually going to repurpose some stuff that I've recorded elsewhere at considerably lower quality, although many of you might not notice or care. And it's about some content relating to the Bhagavad Gita, partially because I may have mentioned elsewhere in this podcast, I actually teach yoga teacher training modules for philosophy of yoga, history of yoga, a lot of the jnana yoga topics, aka kind of like the yoga of intellect. So I've had students who have expressed interest in this material, and I've made some like videos and presentations and things like this elsewhere. But for those who are just kind of subscribed to the podcast, whether they are my students or not, people have expressed interest in this kind of stuff. So I thought I would just give a little bit of a piece of that material that I've made elsewhere. And this particular piece of that puzzle is about some key terms in the Bhagavad Gita that can be kind of confusing or can get lost in translation just a bit. And it's especially helpful for students of like yoga philosophy who want to get to know this better, but it's also, for my money, like very rich and rewarding for just spiritual seekers in general. So hope you enjoy it. Hope you get something out of it, or somewhere in between those two ideas. Thanks. All right, welcome to the Bhagavad Gita study guide. Continuing on with clarification of some key terms, specifically relating to divinity or God. Something that gets lost in translation in the Bhagavad Gita by the time it gets run through English is we really only have one word for God that a lot of these references end up getting translated, and that's to God, right? Whereas there's several different words for God, gods, God in different forms, all these sorts of things. So let's see if we can clarify some of it. So there's Bhagwan, which in Hinduism is used to signify a deity or avatar, particularly for Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu in Vaishnavism, and for Shiva in Shaivism in India. So Bhagwan is God in a form that can be addressed with a name. That's one kind of easy way to think about it. So it's even easier to do this when a deity takes on an avatar, for example, Vishnu in the form of Krishna. Krishna is like a personality that can be approached. It's a personality that can be like spoken with and conceptualized as a personality, right? And that personality is nonetheless like the Lord God in this way of thinking, but there's some sort of personality handle that you can put on this God figure, right? And Shiva, even though Shiva doesn't, generally speaking, take on avatars, Shiva is nonetheless conceptualized with, in no shortage of traditions, as having a specific form, a specific way of dressing, of behaving, and he might shift forms from time to time. Like he has a wrathful form, he has more of a hermit yogi form, so on and so forth. But there's nonetheless like kind of an anthropomorphized form that one can approach, like a form of God with a personality that can be described one way or another, that can be approached. So Ishvara is also sort of a personal conception of God, particularly as like a God that you serve. And yet Ishvara will have preceded material creation, even if Ishvara can still be conceived of as a person. And I know that might be a little confusing, right? But when we talk about, just a contrast, when we talk about Bhagwan, we can say like, oh, Krishna, and call Krishna Bhagwan. Ishvara, we could still, for another example, describe Krishna's transcendent form, like the form behind Krishna's immanent historical form, as Ishvara, but like Krishna in his Krishna form did not precede creation, if that makes sense. Krishna in his form of Vishnu, or even all of the consciousness and energies that informing Vishnu, that would have been closer to what we would say when we talk about Ishvara. Okay, so it's still transcendent, but it's not impersonal. So impersonal would be like, the divine energy, and we'll talk about that later when we start talking about Brahman. But that is like one easy way to understand the difference. So there are devas, and devas, in a mythological sense, would often be compared to, let's say, like the Olympians of the Greek pantheon. People would say, oh, Indra is like Zeus, or even Indra is like Thor from the Norse Viking pantheon, right? Like he's like a thunder god, and like a warrior figure, and all these sorts of things. But it's not really 100% apt comparison. And devas are not necessarily the quote unquote good guys in this cosmology, and they're not even like the main attraction, so to speak. So like Vishnu and Shiva are of a higher order than the devas, even though the devas, like Indra, Agni, Surya, Yama, they're all powerful, and they all have domains that they sort of govern. And Indra can be called like the king of the gods, but Vishnu and Shiva and even Brahma are all of a higher order of divinity, and like you could almost argue like a greater and even more transcendent layer of reality. So Indra, Agni, Surya, all these figures have foibles. They have flaws. They're a lot more like mortals who happen to have a lot of divine power, right? Particularly the further you go into stories told by the Puranas and all these other sources, where like, Indra is always getting into trouble because of his arrogance, and because of his when he's not actively being a wrathful warrior defending his kingdom, right, and the wealth of his kingdom in heaven, so to speak. When he's not doing that, he's just kind of like loafing around and languishing. And he loafs around and languishes so much that all of a sudden his celestial kingdom is threatened by invaders, like invading asuras or other like, dark contingents. So he gets into trouble. He has flaws. He makes mistakes. He's arrogant, and he has to continually be taught lessons in humility. And these sorts of things are not what Vishnu and Shiva are subject to in any way. They're like all powerful and transcendent, whereas the devas are still quite powerful, but they're a little bit closer to the idea of these flawed Greek gods, even though that's not really 100% apt comparison. So I mentioned that they're in conflict with the asuras, who are kind of like a subterranean group of cosmic beings, and there are flawed analogies where people talk about, like, they say that the devas are kind of like the Olympians, which would make the asuras kind of like the Titans, like this previous order of ascendant beings who were sort of exiled to be subterranean prisoners or whatever. But that's not really quite the same thing here. It's also commonly, asuras is also commonly translated as demons, just as often as deva is translated as gods. And this is where we learn that these terms are not really 100% well translated, right? So asuras are not demons. They might behave demonically in the eyes of English translators, but they can be ruthless. They can be ambitious. They're climbers. So if the devas are kind of the cosmic one percenters, like the cosmic ruling class who mostly subsist off of the efforts of others and just kind of have the privilege of ruling and occasionally the burden of defending their kingdom. The asuras are not that way at all. They're constantly the source of like sort of ambitious energies, very often aggressive energies. And since they're subterranean, they're basically compared to the generators of wealth. And some gross metaphors to kind of describe that are like, let's say, for example, asuras are one of the reasons that precious gems and precious metals are brought up from the subterranean world because of the efforts of the asuras. But there's also lots of mythological layering to explain that, for example, the fertility of crops growing is ultimately due to the battle between the devas, who are mortal, and the asuras, who are not immortal but have the power of regeneration, kind of like regeneration, kind of like direct reincarnation, meaning like they wouldn't get reincarnated into a different body or a different form, but they would get like, if you were to cut one of their heads off suddenly, like their body would regenerate and they would be kind of like reborn in an instant. So these are very different sets of powers, but the analogy there that's often drawn is, asuras they sort of have the same energy that like vegetative plants do in a sense, because like you put all this effort into fertilizing the ground, it rises up from the ground, and you periodically massacre its growth, even though it regenerates itself from growth, and that creates a cycle of fertility. So that's one of the explanations for this like eternal conflict between the devas and the asuras. And even that conflict between the devas and the asuras it's mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita with the assumption that you understand that it's in the backdrop, but it's not really critical or crucial to the story. But since they mention it, and since some of these things get lost in translation, it's a term that's worth clarifying. So, all right, some subtle substances that get talked about in terms of divinity. Brahman, the ultimate reality underlying all phenomena. So everything is ultimately Brahman. Everything is ultimately drawn from the formless and eternal substance of Brahman, which is also like very often described as like the God energy, right? But it's formless and it's beyond Maya, or the veil of illusion. And Maya and the veil of illusion, aka our own perceptual reality, sort of grows and emanates out of this ultimate reality substance of Brahman. But Brahman is also therefore beyond this immediate reality of illusions. So people they'll refer to God sometimes in God's formless state, without particular identities, without particular personalities, but in the like cosmic constant of the substance of ultimate reality from which everything else emanates. That's Brahman. Now, Atman is the supreme underlying self that is shared by both God and all of our individual consciousness, as if it's all drawing from the same pool. So, one splash of a raindrop bouncing up from the ocean when it rains, that is almost sort of like an individual personality emanating from the shared self of Atman. So Atman, like God, like the personality and the mind of God, is within this pool of Atman, and also our own individual personalities and minds draw from that same pool of Atman, which is ultimately the same thing. And in its different forms, we would say Paramatma is the supreme self. So like God self. Jiva Atma would be the individual extensions of that self that pop up from time to time, that have like, their own individual egos, that have the appearance of their own lives and their own souls and all that stuff, but they're like the underlying shared self, which is sometimes translated as soul, would be described as Atman. So like God participates in Atman. Atman is God, but we also participate in Atman. Atman is also us. Purusha and Prakriti. So Purusha, we talked about Atman as the self, right? But Purusha would be the cosmic self energy or intelligence or animating soul, the universal principle. But while it is not married to matter, which in this language is Prakriti. So Prakriti would be like the um, matter or even like form. If we want, like when the Platonists talk about the eternal forms, even if those forms have not taken a specific instance of matter, right? You could even call the forms a variety of Prakriti in this way of thinking. But Purusha being like the formless, but nonetheless like cosmic being or self, or like ultimate consciousness energy, when it's combined with Prakriti, that's what gives rise to life. So you could make a crude analogy here, which is not 100% accurate per se, but it gets you kind of closer to the truth from a Western perspective. Western philosophy has always very much been preoccupied with the like the mind question, as far as there is mind as a substance, and then there's matter, and that there's kind of a dualism, meaning like something is either one or the other. So a mind has a certain kind of existence, and matter has its distinct existence. Like, and somehow or another, a mind can operate within matter, right? Like, a mind can operate from within the matter of your brain or whatever other gross elements of your body produce this phenomenon of mind, right? So that's something like what we're talking about here. Um, but Purusha is like the consciousness, the energy, the whatever, without material existence, and then Prakriti is material existence, which the Purusha animates. And Purusha is eternal, pure, unchanging, but Prakriti is subject to change, is subject to particular material existence. So this intersection of the unchanging with the changing, this intersection of sort of soul with matter, this intersection of like consciousness mind stuff with matter stuff, when Purusha and Prakriti combine, that's what gives rise to life. And by extension, what gives rise to like individual lives, individual consciousness, and these sorts of things. So, three words that to non Hindi speakers, non Sanskrit readers and speakers, they might often get confused because they have a shared root. Brahman is this cosmic principle that we talked about, the substance of ultimate reality, which is like the cosmic principle, the cosmic energy that is the ultimate reality beyond the world of matter and illusion and all that stuff. A Brahmin is the class of priests and sages in the Vedic traditions. Like, they memorize the Vedas. They're the priestly class, kind of like, the Catholic priests in medieval society would have been the priestly group. It's very similar, except it is in India, it's a caste hereditary position. So, like, if your parents were Brahmins, you are born a Brahmin, and so on and so forth. And these days, Brahmins are very often intellectual laborers. So if you do work overseas with programmers, very often the programmers will be of the Brahmin caste, right? Not always, but very often. And then there is Brahma, who is the flawed creator god, meaning like he's not Vishnu, he's not Shiva, but Brahma is the one who just sort of got explosively creative within the world of illusion and Maya, and got kind of lost in his own creation, like got lost in the particularities of his own subjective experience. He got enamored with his own creation. And in the Hindu way of thinking, this is like sort of the opposite of the goal, right? The goal is very often to unify yourself with the ultimate reality beyond the veil of Maya, beyond illusion. And Brahma did the exact opposite. He created so much of material reality and Maya and subjective experience and the veil of illusion. He created so much within that space that he got lost in it. He got enamored with it, and he fell in love with his own creation. And that's one of the reasons why Brahma is not really worshipped much in India in this day and age. So we touched on this earlier, gods and demons, something that is mentioned in the translations to English. Um, so devas and asuras are not interchangeable with gods and demons. Devas are a specific kind of celestial being. They're not at the very top, although they are like very eminent. They're not categorically the good ones, and the asuras are not categorically the bad ones, even though like very often, for whatever reason, the devas are the ones who are backed to win, but not always. So, one very famous example of a case where Vishnu shows that he doesn't necessarily pick sides per se. He gets the devas and the asuras to work together to create the amrita, the elixir of immortality, to churn it from the ocean of milk. And even though at face value he apparently betrays the asuras, he doesn't do it to spite them. He does it because he actually does it to sort of ensure that there's an eternal battle between the devas and the asuras, because this eternal battle becomes sort of a source of creative energies in the world, right? So um, from that perspective, it's not that the devas are good and the asuras are bad. It's just that they each have roles to play. So that makes it not a sufficient analogy to the Olympians and the Titans, because the Olympians basically conquer the Titans, and for the most part, aside from a cameo or two, that's all she wrote for the Titans. But the Asuras are constantly expending energy to rise up in their own hierarchies and in the hierarchies of the universe, and very often they actually achieve their goals, and they just as often they are struck back down, not necessarily because they're evil. That's not really an applicable way of judging these stories, but very often it's just because that they're struck down because the endless climb would not be good for the universe. But what is good for the universe is the energies that are expended to do that, even if Vishnu takes on the role voluntarily of sort of knocking the asuras back down, sort of like you set the dominoes up and then you knock them back down. So this cycle of asuras kind of like expending all this energy to rise up in the world, either the literal world or the cosmic realms, and then Vishnu knocking them down a peg once again. That is a source of inventive and creative energies in the universe, and it actually helps sustain things. So it's not a correct analogy to compare devas to Olympians, asuras to titans. And likewise, this is not a biblical tradition. Devas are not like good in the way that angels are good, and asuras are not evil in the way that demons are evil, even though a lot of the translations do treat it as that. You could call an overly ambitious and amorally ambitious person wicked in a lot of these ways, and it would be more accurate to say something like wicked than evil. Evil is a very loaded term in its source. It implies a cosmic struggle of something that's absolutely good and something that's absolutely evil, and that way of thinking is just absent in this Hindu worldview. Um, it's a lot more relativistic. So um, it's just to summarize, the translation will often say gods and demons when they're talking about devas or asuras. Anytime you read demons or demonic energy, just have this in the background. That's kind of a quirk of translation into English, and probably also an effect of colonialism. And it's not quite really the same sense that's in these original writings. So avatars and demigods. In Greek mythology, you have lots of demigods like Hercules, Achilles, all these quote unquote heroes who have some superhero superheroic supply of divine energies that they make use of, but they usually do it for very egoic, selfish ends, like for glory. Um, and an avatar, by contrast, is when one of these transcendent gods, like Vishnu, typically it is Vishnu, will take a human birth on purpose. Most of the time it's a human. There's many of his early avatars are actually animal forms, but um, you know, infinitely powerful Vishnu will voluntarily take birth in a human avatar to perform some sort of task in the world, in the veil of Maya, in a historical time and place, um, as a function of playing a protector role for the world. And when this infinite and boundless God like Vishnu does this and takes a mortal avatar on purpose, um, it's usually something done out of a sense of both love and obligation, because again, Vishnu is the protector God. He is the preserver of the world. So it's in many ways similar to the idea of Jesus voluntarily being born into the world to suffer. Even though the avatars, like for example Ram, may seem like they're doing very heroic things in the story, and by most people's reckoning they are, it's also not for glory. It's like God doing what God feels like he has to do, even if he's doing it with a sense of play or Leela. So very different ideas of divinity emanating through the mortal form within mortal forms, and for very different purposes.